In 1937, a woman in central Iraq attempted to have an abortion following the death of her husband and earlier son. The abortion failed, and months later the child was born. Later she would remarry, and the boy's stepfather would subject the child to cruel and abusive treatment. Ultimately, that boy would go on to join Iraq's Ba'ath Party, a secular socialist party, and at age 22 he attempted to assassinate the Prime Minister, Abdul Karim Qasim. The assassination failed and he fled to Syria and then Egypt before returning when the military ousted Qasim. In 1968, his Ba'ath Party took government and the now 30-year-old man became the head of its secret police, having risen within the party ranks. A decade later, in 1979, the 42-year-old man became the nation's president, and that man was Saddam Hussein.
Hello there.
Okay, so I want to take you back to the year 2006. I was in the 4th grade trying to beat that pod racing level on LEGO Star Wars, and I kept hearing the name Saddam Hussein pop up. Now, to be honest, I got him confused with this guy, Zinedine Zidane. But I remember feeling sorry for this guy that was being hung. And I was told not to feel sorry for him because the good guys, Bush, Blair and Howard, had won, and the bad guy, Saddam, had lost. And so this is a framework that I want to use in looking at the regime of Saddam Hussein. Was George Bush right or wrong to depose him? And my take on this one will probably surprise you, so make sure to stick around to the end. So though Saddam officially came to power in 1979, he'd been slowly gaining power throughout the 1970s, and he was a canny operator. In the early 1970s, Saddam nationalised Iraq's oil, and so when the 1973 global energy crisis hit, the Iraqi economy really boomed because they had energy. Saddam then used that revenue to fund all sorts of social programs, including free secondary education, hospital care, and then provided substantial economic support to returning soldiers. It was during this period though that military expenditure rapidly grew too, increasing by 40%.
Magnificent, aren't they?
Now, it's important to note that Saddam grew up more or less in a warlord era, and repressive dictatorships was simply the norm. He actually found it quite surprising that America didn't outlaw criticism of the president. And so it's at this point where many critics of Bush's intervention will say, well, there's dictatorships all over the world, why intervene in Iraq specifically? Well, Saddam was much more hardcore than your average dictator. After becoming the president in 1979, Saddam Hussein orchestrated the Ba'ath Party purge, in which alleged conspirators behind his assassination were publicly named and arrested, and then this was broadcasted to the entire nation. 68 people were found guilty of treason, of which 22 were executed, and then days later, 13 Jewish Zionists were also executed. And so the brutality behind this sort of leadership style is used as a justification for his removal by guys like the late Christopher Hitchens.
Basically chilling, actually, videos ever made in the 20th century. It shows the moment at which Saddam Hussein, the actual moment at which Saddam Hussein seized power in Iraq for himself.
Who gave the bird to Bill Maher's crowd.
I'm just saying that
I've been on the Jon Stewart show, I've been on your show, I've seen you make about 5 George Bush IQ jokes per night. There's no one I know who can't do it. You know what I think? This is now the joke that stupid people laugh at.
However, this happened in 1979, and Bush wouldn't invade until 2 decades later. So, what happened in between? Well, Saddam was actually supported by the Americans. Basically, next door in Iran, the US-backed Shah was overthrown, and the new government, which you can learn about here, was hostile to America and allowed Americans in the Iranian embassy to be taken hostage. Again, Saddam was a canny operator, and he seized this opportunity to invade Iran. And there were several incentives for this invasion. Firstly, this part of Iran, Khuzestan, was oil-rich and could be potentially justified as being rightfully Iraqi, as it was populated more so by Arabs than Persians. Secondly, the Shatt al-Arab waterway was strategically a very useful waterway, and thirdly, Saddam had a genuine reason to be concerned about Iran. Iran was ruled by a member of the Shiite clergy, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and with the Shiite Muslims believing their leadership came from a line of succession appointed by Muhammad himself, they tended to be a more zealous and fanatical sect of Islam. Saddam was worried that this Shiite revolutionary fanaticism would spill over from Iran and that an Islamic republic like Iran's would pop up in Iraq, effectively deposing him. Because Iraqi success would contain their enemy Iran, America backed the Iraqi government. Saddam also received Soviet tanks, gunships and missiles, and British firearms. However, like I said, Iran's population were fanatic believers in the Shiite Islamic Republic and were all too willing to become martyrs and die for the cause. They also received funding from China and North Korea and would eventually be secretly funded by Ronald Reagan.
For 18 months now, we have had underway a secret diplomatic initiative to Iran. That initiative was undertaken for the simplest and best of reasons, to renew a relationship with the nation of Iran, to bring an honorable end to the bloody 6-year war between Iran and Iraq.
The war was extremely bloody, and in 1987, both sides started to bomb each other's capitals, and then in 1988, peace negotiations began and a truce was finalised in 1990. But the war was not the raging success that Saddam had hoped for, and Iraq had been economically devastated from 8 years of war, not to mention that Saddam had lost a lot of face. So, what do? Well, you invade somewhere else, and for Saddam, that was Kuwait. And so this is the second justification that supporters of Bush's Iraqi invasion use. Saddam Hussein was happy to invade anywhere and everywhere that helped his empire, and as any student of history knows, the British made the mistake of allowing Hitler to expand until he became far too powerful, and this mistake ought not to be repeated. For Saddam, Kuwait had oil and he needed oil. He claimed that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq and proceeded with an invasion thinking he had the support of Britain and the USA. Earlier, Saddam had brutally cracked down on Iraq Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north, and America stopped neither. For the Shiites, America was wary of them due to what the Iranian Shiites had done, and for the Kurds, the Soviets, Syria and Turkey were happy to see them repressed due to their own Kurdish populations who wanted their own independence. But Saddam had incorrectly read the situation in Kuwait, and in January 1991, a US-led coalition ordered Saddam to remove all troops. Following Operation Desert Storm, the Iraqis were routed in 4 days and Saddam retreated, losing 90,000 soldiers while the US-led forces only lost 400. So why did the US support Kuwait but not the Kurds? Well, quite frankly, Saddam expanded into Kuwait to get his hands on oil, and this would have made him an oil giant in the Middle East, and he would have had too big of a slice of the pie for the West's liking. Saddam was really ruthless with the Kurds. For instance, in 1991, he drained the marshes that they lived off as punishment for their involvement in an uprising, yet America still wasn't willing to invade off of those grounds alone. As America turned from Iraq's ally to enemy in the 1990s, they then turned to sanctions to pressure the regime, but this did little. In fact, it was the Iraqi people who suffered as a result, with no access to food or medical supplies. And in 1998, Dennis Halliday, who was the director of the UN Relief Program, resigned, deeming the sanctions too immoral. In 1999, UNICEF reported that 500,000 Iraqis had died from malnutrition or lack of medicines as a result of the sanctions. In 1997, the International Atomic Energy Agency also inspected Iraq and discovered that the Iraqis had all the necessary components to manufacture nuclear warheads and that construction was actually underway. In 1998, they then destroyed all of Iraq's nuclear testing sites. Fast forward to 2002, and on the back of 9/11, Bush called for a complete invasion of Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
On 4 main premises. Firstly, Saddam allegedly had biological and nuclear weapons, including ballistic missiles that could travel over 1,200 kilometers. Secondly, 9/11 prompted the need for terrorist organizations to be constrained. Thirdly, Iraq was harboring terrorists, including al-Qaeda affiliates. And then finally, Britain allowed Hitler to expand in the 1930s, and if he was confronted earlier, the Nazis simply wouldn't have been as powerful. Saddam was similar to Hitler in this situation. They began their invasion in 2003, and though they were slowed down by being unable to pass through Turkey, the Iraqis were no match, and many began to desert Saddam a month into the invasion. He was arrested and then executed in 2006, but let's go back to those 4 points that Bush used as justification. When it came to weapons of mass destruction, it's highly unlikely that Iraq could have produced them after facing a decade of sanctions and then destroying their facilities in 1998. Secondly, it would have been stupid of Saddam to use them against the USA, and he definitely would have known that any use of them against America would have certainly led to his deposition. Thirdly, when it came to the Hitler effect, Iraq hadn't attempted an invasion since Kuwait in 1991, and they were much less powerful than they used to be. An invasion of Iraq was hardly bludgeoning a growing power. Ultimately, a congressional report in 2004 revealed no evidence of weapons of mass destruction and no links to al-Qaeda. So was Bush wrong to depose Saddam? Well, I guess, but I don't think it is that simple. Firstly, the sanctions clearly hadn't worked throughout the 1990s and only served to punish the Iraqi people. Secondly, the West had received wide criticism for doing nothing during the Rwandan genocide, and by not intervening, they allowed a huge atrocity to happen in 1994. Saddam had a pretty stacked resume of local repression, including the Ba'ath Party purge and targeted attacks on Kurds and Shiites. If Bush did nothing, I could easily see those same jokes being made about a president who turned a blind eye to evil. That being said, for a Texan president, I'm sure that oil was pretty sweet. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think below. How should Bush have dealt with Saddam? Stay tuned for next week as we look at the beginning of Trump's trade war with China, and we can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.